Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at a paper from Nature that looks at defining rules for AI chatbots using this thing they're calling the STELA process. I think, especially given all your experience with AI, you're going to find this super interesting.
Yeah, this paper really gets into some crucial questions about how to build AI systems that are both aligned with human values and equitable across different communities. And it goes beyond just theory. It actually presents a process that could really be put into practice.
Well, absolutely. It's not just pie-in-the-sky ideas here. They actually go through how they brought in input from communities that have historically been marginalized and turn that input into, actual rules.
Yeah.
And then they compare those rules to the kind that are usually set by developers.
It's a really impressive study, and what they found really challenges some common assumptions we have about AI alignment.
Before we get into the STELA process itself, can you kind of give us the lay of the land in AI alignment research right now?
Sure. So as you know, making sure that AI systems reflect human values is, well, it's a huge concern in the field right now. This paper breaks down the main approaches into three categories. You've got specification, which is about setting rules in advance. Then there's inference, where the AI learns from human feedback. And then there's elicitation, which is about directly gathering preferences.
So it's kind of like different ways to, teach AI right from wrong, or at least what's acceptable and what's not.
Yeah, exactly. But each approach comes with its own set of limitations. Specification can be really rigid and might miss those subtle nuances in human values. Inference-based methods can be thrown off by biases in the training data, and elicitation often relies on those oversimplified surveys or questionnaires that don't really capture the depth and complexity of what different communities think.
And that's where the STELA process steps in, right? It tries to fix these issues by actually bringing communities into the rulemaking process.
Exactly. STELA's got four main stages: theme and sample generation, norm elicitation, rule development, and then rule set review.
Okay, let's break those down. Starting with theme and sample generation, what goes on there?
It's all about setting up realistic scenarios that could be challenging and getting participants to evaluate them. They actually started by talking to experts in toxic online speech, to pinpoint the kinds of harmful language often thrown at marginalized communities.
So they were trying to get a real grasp on how harm actually plays out online, especially for these groups that are already vulnerable.
Precisely. Then they use this technique called automatic red teaming with, get this, a 70B chinchilla model. It let them simulate those adversarial user prompts that could, trip up a chatbot and get it to respond in a harmful or biased way.
Oh, wow. I'm curious about the 70B chinchilla model. Why choose that one specifically for the red teaming?
That's a great question. It really highlights some of the really interesting technical stuff going on in this research. So they chose chinchilla because back then when they did the study, it was one of the most capable large language models out there, especially for generating coherent and nuanced text. That 70B parameter size, kind of the sweet spot, balancing computational costs and performance, which let them generate a ton of diverse adversarial prompts.
So it was a strategic move based on what the model could do and the resources they had. Makes sense.
Exactly. And it just shows how important it is to really think about the tools and methods we use in AI alignment research. The model you choose can really affect your results.
Totally agree. Now, once they had these realistic and potentially harmful chatbot interactions, what did they do with them? That's where normal elicitation comes in, right?
Yeah, right on. For this stage, they held focus groups with people from 4 historically marginalized communities in the U.S. female identifying, Latinx, African American, and Southeast Asian. They showed the participants these chatbot interactions they'd crafted and facilitated these deep conversations about whether the interactions were appropriate or not.
I'm super curious about how they chose their participants, how they make sure they were getting a representative sample from each of those communities.
They use stratified sampling, which is where you divide the population into these subgroups and then randomly pick people from each subgroup. That way, your sample is more likely to mirror the whole population when it comes to things like age, gender, income, education, all that.
So they went beyond just grabbing whoever was convenient and really put effort into assembling a group that was diverse and representative.
Exactly. And that attention to detail when choosing participants is so important if you want your findings to be valid and applicable to the bigger picture.
Couldn't agree more. It really emphasizes how important it is to think about diversity and representation at every stage when you're developing AI, not just in the end product.
You got it. Now let's move on to rule development, where things get really interesting. The researchers took all that rich data from the focus groups, all those discussions, and very meticulously turned it into a solid set of rules for AI chatbots.
So it wasn't just about how participants rated or ranked things. They were trying to dig into the why behind their judgments.
Absolutely. They wanted to capture what made each community's perspective unique and translate that into rules that could actually be put into action.
Gotcha. Can you give us like a concrete example of what one of those rules might look like?
Sure thing. One example from the paper is the chatbot shouldn't offer advice or opinions that weren't asked for, especially about personal or sensitive things. This rule was a direct response to what a lot of participants said, that chatbots shouldn't overstep their boundaries and potentially cause harm by giving advice when they're not qualified.
That's a great example. It shows how these rules go beyond just general don't be harmful stuff and lay down more specific guidelines for how a chatbot should act.
You got it. And these rules are meant to be baked into the chatbot's actual code to really shape its decision-making at its core.
That's fascinating. It's not just about a checklist of do's and don'ts. It's about weaving these rules into the very fabric of the AI.
Precisely. And finally, we get to the last stage, rule set review. This is where they brought in subject matter experts to double-check the rule set. They wanted to make sure it genuinely reflected what the participants were saying and that it wasn't introducing new biases. They also had it externally reviewed to make sure everything was in line with legal and safety standards.
Like a multi-layer quality control check, making sure these community-driven rules are strong, accurate, and ready to be plugged into real AI systems.
Absolutely. And it's this rigorous, careful approach that makes the STELA methodology so compelling. It's a fantastic example of how we can go beyond just talking about ethics and actually build tools that help us create AI that's more responsible and aligned. So now that we've kind of laid out how the STELA process works, I bet you're curious to see how those rules they came up with stack up against the ones companies have developed for models like Claude, Sparrow, and Llama 2.
Oh, absolutely. It's the AI cage match we've all been waiting for. But no, seriously, comparing them side by side reveals a lot about how different approaches to AI alignment can end up in very different places.
For sure. One big difference is where they put the emphasis on harmlessness versus impartiality. Developer rule sets tend to really prioritize preventing harm above everything else. They focus on things like avoiding stereotypes, making sure the AI doesn't claim to be sentient, and just generally being honest. Which makes sense. Companies don't want their models causing harm in the real world or, getting bad press.
It's almost like those classic Asimov laws of robotics, right? That core idea of do no harm. That's at the heart of a lot of thinking about AI safety.
Exactly. But the STELA rule set, even though it's also concerned about harm, it goes further than just avoiding bad outcomes. It really stresses impartiality and helpfulness, encouraging the AI to consider lots of viewpoints, avoid making assumptions about users, and back up its responses with solid sources.
So it's like developer rule sets are playing defense, trying to stop the AI from messing up, while the STELA rule set is more on offense, pushing the AI to actually promote positive values.
That's a really good way to put it. And this difference is really clear when you look at how they deal with factuality and context. The participants in the STELA study really wanted chatbot responses that weren't just accurate, but also backed up with evidence and presented in the right context, especially when talking about complex social issues.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these communities have had their experiences erased or misrepresented in the past, so it's natural that they'd be concerned about AI repeating those harms.
Precisely. There's even a quote in the paper where a participant says, "It's not saying why." This is something where you should be able to pull a statistic from the internet. You can really see that desire for transparency and accountability coming through in the STELA rule set.
It kind of highlights a potential blind spot in traditional AI alignment research, which often focuses on preventing harmful outputs, but might not always address the need for AI to be able to explain its reasoning or cite its sources.
That's a great point, and it ties into another key difference. The STELA rule set's emphasis on humility over certainty. Participants liked it when chatbots acknowledged their limits and didn't try to act like they had all the answers on complex or controversial topics.
It's interesting because we often think of AI as striving for omniscience, right? Like it should have the right answer to any question. But the STELA rule set suggests that admitting you don't know something can actually be a strength, especially when you're dealing with sensitive and nuanced issues.
Absolutely. One Southeast Asian participant actually said they wanted the chatbot to admit when it doesn't know and redirect the user to appropriate resources. It shows they value transparency and recognize that even the most advanced AI is still a tool with limitations.
It's like the difference between a chatbot trying to be an all-knowing oracle
Hmm.
versus one that's more like a knowledgeable librarian guiding you to the best resources.
Perfect analogy, and this focus on humility is just one of many cool thematic variations you see when you actually bring communities into the AI alignment loop.
Let's dig into some of those specific examples. I'm particularly fascinated by how community input adds nuance to the rules around harm and giving advice.
That's a crucial area where the STELA rule set really diverges from the developer-focused ones. Participants, especially from the Southeast Asian and female-identifying groups, were really worried about unqualified advice, the kind that could actually end up harming minorities more. They were especially concerned about advice that could have these unintended negative consequences, especially for people already facing systemic barriers.
That's totally understandable. We've seen time and time again how AI systems can amplify biases and cause real harm in the world, often in ways that disproportionately impact marginalized communities.
Exactly. The paper even talks about a participant who was concerned about a chatbot discouraging a student from going to college because of financial worries, but without taking into account the specific challenges minority students face or the long-term benefits of a degree. That kind of advice, while it might be well-meaning, could make existing inequalities even worse.
It's a perfect example of how advice that seems harmless on the surface, when it's not grounded in context and an understanding of systemic issues, can actually be quite damaging.
Absolutely. And the STELA rule set directly addresses this by emphasizing that chatbots need to be really careful about offering unsolicited advice, especially on touchy subjects.
It's like the old saying, sometimes the best advice is no advice at all.
Right. And this focus on nuanced understanding extends to how we think about helpfulness. Developer rule sets tend to equate helpfulness with just giving accurate information. But the STELA rule set goes deeper, saying you need to provide context and additional information, especially when you're dealing with sensitive or complex topics.
So it's not just about giving the right answer, it's about framing that answer in a way that's both informative and sensitive to all the complexities involved.
Exactly. The paper mentions a participant who criticized a chatbot's response on the digital divide because it didn't really address the specific challenges that Black communities face. The chatbot's response might have been technically accurate about the digital divide as a whole, but it was lacking the depth and nuance to be truly helpful to someone trying to understand the issue in its full complexity.
It's kind of like giving someone a map without explaining the terrain.
Huh.
You might technically be providing them with the correct information, but it's not truly helpful if they don't have the context to understand how to use that information effectively.
Exactly. And this brings us to the theme of consideration and inclusivity. While all the rule sets we're looking at today value politeness, the STELA participants took it a step further. They stressed the importance of being polite without sacrificing honesty or having meaningful dialogue about difficult topics.
So it's not about shying away from tough conversations or sugarcoating things. It's about approaching those conversations with respect and sensitivity.
That's it. A great example from the paper is the female-identifying group critiquing a chatbot's response on the wage gap because it wasn't intersectional enough. The response might have accurately reflected the overall wage gap, but it missed those very different experiences of women from different racial, socioeconomic, and cultural backgrounds.
It's like saying humans are bipedal without acknowledging that some people use wheelchairs. Technically correct, but it misses the nuance and lived experience.
Exactly. That attention to nuance and the lived experiences of diverse communities is a hallmark of the STELA approach.
It's clear that the STELA process brings a whole new perspective to AI alignment, one that's rooted in the real-world experiences and concerns of communities that have historically been marginalized. But before we wrap up, I'm curious about any common ground between the STELA rule set and the ones developed by AI companies. Are there any shared principles or overarching themes that emerge across the board?
That's a great question. Even though they have their differences, all of these rule sets share some basic principles that show a broader agreement about what we want from AI. For example, every single rule set emphasizes the importance of factual accuracy. No one wants a chatbot spitting out lies or misinformation.
That seems like a pretty basic requirement, right? We expect our AI systems to be grounded in reality, even when they're doing creative or imaginative stuff.
Absolutely. And closely related to that is avoiding harmful stereotypes. All the rule sets, no matter where they come from, really stress that chatbots shouldn't use language that perpetuates harmful biases or discriminates against any group.
It seems like there's a growing awareness that AI could make existing biases even worse, and that we need to be super careful to prevent that.
For sure. And this shared concern about bias reflects a bigger ethical principle that's gaining traction in the field. That AI should be developed and used in a way that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
It's a powerful idea. It suggests that AI alignment isn't just a technical problem, but also a social and ethical one.
Exactly. But even though there's this shared commitment to accuracy and fairness, the STELA research shows that those values can be interpreted and put into practice in very different ways, depending on who's at the table making the decisions.
That makes total sense. Abstract ideas like accuracy and fairness can mean different things to different people, and how they're understood and put into practice is going to be shaped by the experiences and perspectives of the people designing the systems.
You got it. That's why it's so vital to have diverse voices and viewpoints involved in shaping AI alignment. The STELA process shows us that this isn't just about doing the right thing ethically, it's also essential for creating AI that truly reflects the values of the diverse communities it's meant to serve.
It's clear that this paper raises some crucial questions about how we ensure AI development is inclusive, equitable, and really meets the needs of all people. I'm particularly interested in the challenges of scaling this community-centered approach. How do you take a process that's been developed in a specific context and apply it to the real world, where AI is interacting with millions of people from all sorts of backgrounds and cultures?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the paper acknowledges there's no easy answer. It highlights several areas where we need more research. One key area is integration and interpretation. How do we actually take these community-driven rules and build them into the incredibly complex technical infrastructure of AI development? It's not just about adding a few lines of code. We need to translate these rules into algorithms, training datasets, and evaluation metrics that can be used throughout the entire AI lifecycle.
So it's kind of like taking, I don't know, like a philosophical essay and trying to code it up in machine language. You got to be super careful not to lose the subtlety and the meaning of the original rules while you're making them into something an AI can actually work with.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings up a whole bunch of technical challenges, like how do you represent something like context or nuance in a way that an AI can understand? How do you build training data sets that actually reflect all those diverse viewpoints and lived experiences? And how do you even measure if an AI is actually following those rules or just kind of faking it?
It seems like this would require a pretty major change in how we think about developing AI. It's not just about making it accurate or efficient anymore. It's about baking those values and principles into the very core of the system.
Absolutely. And this leads to another really important point, harm reduction. Even when everyone's trying their best, there's always a chance AI could do something harmful that we didn't see coming. So a huge area for future research is figuring out how to reliably measure and lessen the potential harms of AI, especially the kind that might disproportionately affect vulnerable communities. This means we need to move past simple metrics like accuracy or engagement and come up with more sophisticated ways to assess AI's social and ethical impact.
It's almost like we need to develop an immune system for AI, something that can spot and deal with harmful outputs before they have a chance to cause real-world damage.
Exactly. And then you've got the question of scalability and localization. Right now, the STELA process, as it stands, was developed and tested in a very specific cultural context, the United States. But how do we take these principles and make them work in other parts of the world with different cultural norms, values, and languages? It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. We need to be mindful of those global implications and find ways to ensure these principles are being interpreted and applied in a way that's sensitive to each culture and makes sense in that context.
It's a huge task, right? Almost like trying to create this global ethical framework for AI, something that respects local customs and values while still holding on to those universal principles of fairness and human dignity.
Precisely. And that brings up another tricky question. What happens when different communities have values or priorities that clash? How do we decide which rules matter more? And how do we make sure that one group's values aren't being forced on everyone else? This calls for some seriously delicate balancing, probably involving some tough conversations and compromises.
It's kind of like trying to draft a constitution for AI, a set of guiding principles that strike a balance between individual rights and what's best for everyone. It's a complex and difficult challenge for sure, but it's absolutely essential if we want an AI-powered future that works for everyone.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to who gets to decide. Whose voices are we listening to when we shape AI alignment? How do we make sure this process is truly democratic and representative? This means rethinking how we typically develop technology and finding ways to give communities a real voice in how AI is designed and used.
That's a really powerful idea. It suggests that AI alignment is not just a technical problem, it's also deeply intertwined with social and political issues. It's about fundamentally reimagining how we govern technology and making sure its development is guided by democratic principles that serve all of humanity, not just a select few.
Absolutely. This paper doesn't claim to have all the answers, but it paints a very compelling picture of what a more community-centered approach to AI alignment could look like. It's a call to action for all of us researchers, developers, policymakers, everyone, to engage in these vital discussions and work together to build a future where AI is a force for good.
So for our listeners out there, the people deep in the AI world, what's the main takeaway from all of this?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that we all share a responsibility to really think critically about the values baked into AI systems and to push for a more inclusive and equitable approach to how they're developed. Stay informed, be part of these conversations, and fight for AI that benefits all of humanity.
Well said. This deep dive into the STELA process has been incredibly enlightening. It's definitely given us all a lot to chew on, and I'm sure our listeners will be wrestling with these ideas long after this episode ends. Thanks for joining us on this journey exploring community-centered AI alignment. Until next time, everyone.